A scarred trapper hadn't spoken to a soul until the mute girl signed his name. The beaver pelt was frozen stiff when I pulled it off the rack, and I remember the particular sound of it, like cracking a green log that isn't quite ready. February morning, cold like the cold, had a grudge against everything alive. My breath came out in a long fog, and I stood there in front of the cabin holding the pelt flat as a board, while the sun sat low and orange on the ridge and didn't offer a thing in the way of warmth. 11 years I'd been working that stretch of the Laramie Fork. 11 years of the same routine: set the line, pull the catch, scrape and stretch and dry, trade the bales in town maybe twice a season, come back out, repeat. I didn't talk to many people. I didn't try to. Had my reasons, which I'll get to. I was 43 that winter, which isn't old, not by a fair reckoning, but I'd accumulated years like a man accumulates scar tissue. Not all at once, just steadily, until one day you look down and realize there's more scar than smooth. The fire needed wood, so I set the pelt back on the rack and went around to the split pile, and that's when I saw the smoke coming from the Dunmore cabin. Dunmore had been dead 7 months. Timber come down on him in the high country in June. His mule dragged him back, but he was gone before I could do a thing. We weren't close, Dunmore and me. We trade a word at the trading post, share a fire once or twice over the years when the weather went wrong, but he was the only human being for 6 miles in any direction. And when a man dies that way, even a man you barely know, it takes something out of the air around the place. The cabin had sat empty. His people were back east. Nobody had come for his goods or his tools. I'd checked on it a few times, the way you check on things that aren't yours but are your responsibility. Boarded the one broken window, put a stone on the door latch. The stone was gone, and there was smoke from the chimney. I didn't move for a moment. Then I went and got my rifle. I'm not a suspicious man by nature, or wasn't once, but I'd had trouble with claim jumpers before, and I wasn't about to walk up to an occupied cabin unarmed. I came around the south side through the scrub pine, keeping low, and I came up to the window I'd boarded and listened. Silence, then a cough dry, like something caught in a throat, then the soft clunk of something iron being set on a hearth. I went around to the door and knocked. No answer. I knocked again and said, "I know you're in there. I'm Callum Briggs. I trapped this stretch. You're in my neighbor's cabin. I'm not hostile, but I need to know who's inside." Nothing. I waited maybe 30 seconds, which is longer than it sounds when you're standing in the cold with your thumb on a rifle hammer. Then I heard the boards creak, someone crossing the floor, and the latch lifted and the door opened an inch. One eye brown and young and not particularly frightened, more assessing. I stepped back so she could see both my hands. I let the rifle hang loose, barrel down. The door opened wider. She was maybe 22, 23, dressed for hard travel, heavy coat, worn through at one elbow, boots laced with a piece of rawhide where the original lacing had broken. Dark hair pushed back behind her ears, a bruise along her left jaw that was a week old at minimum, fading from purple to the yellow-green. That means it isn't going to get worse, but still looks like it did plenty of damage getting there. She looked at me, I looked at her. Then she raised her hand, slow and deliberate, and made a motion, fingers together, something like a wave but not a wave, a flat opening of the palm toward me. Then she held both hands up, palms out, and shook her head just slightly. I didn't know what any of it meant. I was not a man familiar with hand talk, but I understood the second part, or thought I did. She was showing me empty hands. No weapon, or no threat, something in that direction. I said, "You alone in there?" She nodded. "You all right?" She tilted her head. That universal motion that means, define all right. "You need food?" She nodded, no hesitation. "Give me 20 minutes, I said. I didn't know then that she couldn't speak. I thought she was afraid to, which made sense given the bruise and the rawhide laces, and the general look of a person who'd been moving hard and fast and hadn't stopped long enough to wash their face. I didn't push it. A person's entitled to be quiet if they want to. I went back to my cabin and put a pot of salt pork and dried beans on the fire, sliced some hardtack, and when it was close to ready, I carried it over with a canteen of water and a spare tin cup. She let me in. The cabin was cold, she just got the fire going and the wood was green, so I pulled 2 better pieces from the stack she'd found and got it burning right. She watched me do it. Not nervously, just watched, the way you watch someone do something you might want to know how to do. We sat, her on the cot and me on the one stool, and she ate. She ate like she was disciplined about it, not frantic, taking slow bites, chewing completely, drinking water between bites. Somebody had taught her, I thought, how to eat after a long, hungry stretch without making herself sick. Somebody had taken some care with her at some point. When she was done, she set the bowl on the floor. Then she looked at me and made a gesture I didn't understand, sort of like drawing something in the air or writing. I said, "I don't follow." She looked around the cabin, found a scrap of board leaning against the wall, and found a burned stick in the cold ash near the hearth, and she wrote on the board in careful letters, "Thank you. My name is Della Marsh." I said, "Callum Briggs." She pointed at the board at her name and then turned it toward me and wrote, "I cannot speak. I have never been able to." I didn't say anything for a moment. I probably looked like what I was, which was a man who didn't quite know what to do with that information. Then I said, "All right. Does it bother you when people look at you like they don't know what to do with it?" She thought about that. Then she wrote, "Yes, but you stopped faster than most." I picked up my canteen and hat and said, "Get some sleep. I'll check on you tomorrow." She wrote one more word before I left, "Wait." I waited. She pointed at me. Then, deliberate and slow, she brought both her hands up in front of her chest, fingers spread, and crossed her wrists, not like she was bound, more like she was framing something, and then she pointed at me again. I said, "I don't know what that means." She wrote on the board, "It means you. Your name in sign. I am showing you how to say your name." I looked at the hand shape. I tried it, clumsy, fingers thicker than they ought to be for that kind of thing. She watched, and then for the first time she almost smiled. Not quite, something around the eyes. She wrote, "Close enough." I did not sleep well that night. Not because I was troubled by her, particularly. Just because the geometry of things had changed and I could feel it, the way you feel weather coming before it arrives. Somebody was in the Dunmore cabin. Somebody was 6 miles closer to me than anybody had been in years, and it was a young woman who communicated in sign and wrote on burned boards and had a 2-week-old bruise on her jaw and ate like someone had taught her to be careful about it. I lay there in the dark and listened to the wind work at the eaves, and I told myself it wasn't my business, whatever her situation was. People passed through the mountains. They stopped where they needed to stop. She'd move on when she was ready, and it wasn't my job to be concerned about it one way or another. I didn't believe a word of that, but I told it to myself anyway, and eventually I slept. In the morning I put together a second portion of the salt pork and beans, wrapped it in cloth, and walked over to the Dunmore cabin. She was already up, smoke from the chimney. The door cracked an inch to let the overnight damp out. I knocked, and she opened it and looked at the bundle in my hands. She pointed at me, then at the bundle, then made a questioning motion, one hand open, tilted slightly, the universal shape of Y. I said, "In case you were hungry, that pork'll keep another day." She stepped back and let me in. That was a Thursday in February, as near as I could track it. By Saturday I knew she was going to stay for a while, and by the end of the following week I'd accepted it. She was fixing the cabin herself, patching the wall mud where it had crumbled out, rehanging the door hinge Dunmore had never gotten around to, cleaning the chimney stack with a bundle of willow branches tied to a pole. She wasn't asking permission. She wasn't waiting for me to decide if it was all right. She was just doing what needed doing, and she did it with a competence that made me revise my first impression of her entirely. I don't know what I thought she was at first. Someone in trouble, clearly. Someone who needed a place to land. I didn't think she was stupid or helpless, but I think I assumed, without meaning to, that she'd require a kind of tending. She didn't. She was the most self-sufficient person I'd encountered in years of living among self-sufficient people. She'd come from Nebraska. I got that in pieces over the first few weeks, sometimes a written note left on my door in the morning when she'd thought of something in the night, sometimes an exchange when she came over with her board and burned stick. Her father had been a sign language teacher at a school for deaf children in Lincoln. He was dead now. She'd written just that, dead now, and didn't add anything, and I didn't ask. After he was gone, she'd been passed to a cousin in Cheyenne, and the cousin had a husband, and the husband had eventually made it clear that Della's presence in his house was contingent on a thing she wasn't willing to be contingent on. She'd left in October. It was now February. She'd been moving since then, towns, other homesteads. She didn't say exactly, until she'd come up into the hills following the Laramie Fork because someone had told her there were trappers up here who mostly kept to themselves and wouldn't bother her. I asked once, written back on her own board, if she was planning to stay the whole winter. She wrote, "Is that a problem?" I wrote, "No." She wrote, "Then why ask?" I didn't have a good answer. I wrote, "Just didn't want to assume." She wrote, "I will tell you when I leave. I always tell people where I am going if they are good to me." I thought about that for the rest of the day. The thing about living alone a long time is that you think you've made peace with it. You think the silence is something you chose and you've gotten used to and it suits you fine. And then something changes and you realize you hadn't made peace with it at all. You just stopped noticing how much it cost. It wasn't noise, she added. She was, by nature, the quietest person I'd ever been around. When she moved through the cabin she'd built for herself out of what Dunmore had left, she barely registered. When she came to my door, which started happening every few days, then every other day, then most days toward the end of February, it wasn't her footsteps I heard first. It was just that there'd be a knock, and the knock itself had a quality to it, measured and even, that I'd come to recognize. What she added was attention. The sense of someone nearby who was paying attention to things, who noticed when the split pile was getting low before I did, who would look at something I'd done, the way I'd stretched a pelt, the angle I'd leaned a new rack, and if it wasn't quite right, she'd tilt her head and make a small gesture that meant look again. I didn't mind being corrected. I'd expected to. I minded being wrong, which is different. When she was right, which she was more often than I wanted to admit, I just fixed it. She was learning the trapline. Not formally, I hadn't asked her, hadn't offered to teach her, but she started walking it with me in the mornings, and she watched how I set and baited and pulled, and after the third or fourth time she started pointing at places along the creek bank that I wasn't using, places where the ice had been worked in a particular way or the reed flat had been pressed down in a pattern she'd learned to read somewhere. She was right about those two. Two of the sets she pointed out were the most productive I had that winter. I asked her one evening where she'd learned about trap setting. She wrote, "My father took me into the field sometimes. He said it was important that I know how things worked, how to provide for myself. He said I would need to know more than other women." She wrote the last sentence without any particular bitterness, just a fact, like she'd accepted the terms of it. I wrote back he was right. She looked at what I'd written for a moment, then she wrote, "Yes, I miss him." I said out loud, "I know, I'm sorry." It was the most personal thing I'd said to her, or to anyone, in I didn't know how long. A year, 2. I don't count those kinds of things. I just registered after I said it that it felt like exercise felt on the first warm day of spring, when you'd spent months doing only what you had to, a little raw but good. The scar. I ought to say something about the scar. I was 19 years old, and there was a fire on a ranch. I was working north of Fort Collins. I helped pull two men out, which I'm not telling you to make it sound noble. I'm telling you because the second man was deeper in than the first, and by the time I got him out, the left side of my face and neck had taken serious damage. Not grotesque, not something people scream at, but significant. The kind of thing that reads immediately on a face, that changes the way people look at you or choose not to. I spent several years trying to forget it mattered. Then I spent several more deciding it didn't matter, which wasn't quite the same thing. I worked alone, mostly. I went to town when I had to and got it done fast and came back out. I'd had one or two brief connections with women over the years. Nothing that lasted, not because of the scar, or not only, but because a man who lives the way I'd chosen to live isn't easy to get close to, and I hadn't made it easier. There was a woman in Laramie once, a widow who ran a dry goods counter and had kind eyes and didn't recoil when she saw me. We talked a few times over the course of a winter, easy talk, the kind that builds something. Or I thought it did. One afternoon I came in from the fork with a good catch and something loose and almost light in my chest, and she was behind the counter talking to a man I didn't know, and the way she smiled at him was different from the way she'd smiled at me, and I understood something about what I was to her in that moment that I hadn't let myself understand before. Something convenient. Something that could be used to pass the slow months between things that actually mattered. I'm not bitter about it. I say that because it sounds like the kind of thing a bitter man would say, but it's true. I don't carry anger about it. I just understood after that the nature of what I had to offer and what I didn't, and I went back to the fork and got on with things. The trading post was the outer edge of my social world. Mackinnon, who was a careful man with a short beard and hands like old leather, never commented on the scar, never looked at it unless he forgot himself, and we did our business straight and occasionally sat by his stove and drank coffee without saying much, and that was sufficient. A few other trappers came through the fork over the years. A Shoshone man named Runs Fast who traded me beaver musk for dried elk one spring. A Frenchman named Delacroix who'd been working the high country for a season and then moved on, and I'd gotten along fine with both. But they weren't permanent, and permanent was what the silence was. Della didn't react to the scar at all. Not the first day, not any day after. I kept waiting for the moment, that particular moment I'd learned to brace for, where someone's eyes moved to it and then consciously moved away, the way you don't look at a lame dog because you don't want to make the dog feel noticed. She just didn't do it. She looked at my face when I spoke to her, at my mouth mostly, which I later realized was because lip reading was one of the ways she caught what people said when there was no other option. She wasn't looking away from the scar. She was looking at me, same as she looked at everything, directly, fully, without flinching at what she found. I think this is what started whatever it was that started. Not a sudden thing, not a moment I could point to, just that she treated me like a person, a specific person, not scarred trapper. Not that fellow who lives up the fork, Callum Briggs, whom she was in the habit of looking at directly and correcting when he was wrong about where to set a trap. March came in hard. There was a week in the middle of it where the temperature didn't get above 0, and the snow came in sideways off the ridge and the trapline was useless. I boarded up the 2 north-facing windows in my cabin and spent the time rehafting tools and mending leather and reading the one book I had, which I'd read maybe a dozen times, a surveyor's account of the territory that wasn't particularly interesting but was words, and words are company after a fashion. Della came over on the 3rd day. She had a cut on her left hand, not deep, but open, and she knocked, and when I opened the door she just held it up, matter of fact, like she was presenting evidence. I let her in and cleaned it and wrapped it with a piece of clean cloth I had for the purpose. She sat at my table and watched me work, and when I was done, she reached over and tapped the book I'd left face down on the table. I said, "You want to read it?" She shook her head. She pointed at me, then at the book, then at her ear, a gesture that by now I'd learned meant she wanted to hear, or the closest thing to it for her, which was watching me. I said, "You want me to read aloud?" She nodded and made the flat palm gesture she'd showed me that first day. I'd learned by then it was a general purpose please or thank you or, sometimes, simply yes. I read to her for 2 hours. Not a single part of that surveyor's report is worth recounting, but the reading wasn't about the report. The reading was, I don't know what it was, filling the cabin with something. Me providing the sound of it and her sitting across the table with her chin in her hand and the snow coming against the boards outside and both of us in the warmth. When I stopped, she wrote on her board, "You have a good voice." I said, "I don't use it much." She wrote, "I know, it is a waste." That sat with me a while, not painful, just sat there. What she told me about the cousin's husband, the implication of it, I didn't ask about directly. It wasn't my place, and she hadn't offered the details, and I wasn't going to push into something she'd chosen not to share. But I thought about it, a certain number of times, lying in the dark listening to the wind work at the roof. What kind of man does what that kind of man does? And whether there was any chance he'd come this far up looking for her. I mentioned it once indirect. I said, "You expecting anybody to come looking for you?" She thought for a moment. Then she wrote, "Not here. He is a man who does not go far from his own territory. I made sure he would not want to follow." I said, "What does that mean, you made sure?" She wrote, "He tried to stop me from leaving. I made leaving painful for him. He will tell people I attacked him unprovoked. He will not tell them why." I looked at her. She met my eyes calm, and there was nothing in her expression that was ashamed or boastful, just a woman who'd made a decision she stood by. I said, "Good." She blinked once. I think that might have surprised her. I said, "A man who does that has it coming. Whatever you did, he had it coming." She wrote slowly, "Most men don't say that." I said, "Most men haven't trapped alone for 11 years. You get perspective." She wrote, "What kind of perspective?" I said that there's men who take and men who don't, and the ones who don't are the ones worth any portion of your time. The rest aren't worth the effort of hating. She sat with that. Then she wrote, "Are you in the second group?" It wasn't quite a question on the board. She hadn't put a mark at the end. It was more like she was setting it down to see how it sat. I said, "I try to be." She wrote, "I know." Then she picked up her coat and went back to her cabin through the snow, and I sat at the table for a while and looked at the empty board and the burned stick she'd left on the corner of the table. April. The snow pulled back from the lower valleys, and the creek came up loud and brown-red with melt, and there were days with real sun in them, the kind that had weight and warmth both. I started ranging further on the line, working the high country sets, and Della started coming with me not just on the lower stretches but all the way up, which was a serious walk, and she did it without complaint, and without ever asking me to slow down. She was strong. I'd known that in a general way, but the high country walks showed it plainly, how she moved on rough terrain, sure-footed and economical, never wasting motion. She'd stop sometimes and look at something, a hawk working the updrafts, the pattern of snow melt on a south-facing slope, the ice still hanging in shadow on the north sides of rocks, and her expression in those moments was something I could only call satisfaction, like she was exactly where she wanted to be. There was an afternoon in April when we were working a high set above the third switchback, and she found sign I hadn't, otter, a family of them, working under the east bank of a side creek I'd written off. She crouched in the slushy snow and showed me the slide marks and the five-toed prints, pointing out the pattern of them, the angle of entry into the water. I crouched beside her and she walked me through it in signs I now mostly understood, and there was something in the way she did it, not condescending, not performing knowledge, just showing me something she'd found and wanted me to see. That was the most natural exchange I'd had with another person in longer than I could say. I set 3 traps in that section over the next week. All 3 came up with catch. She didn't say I told you so. She didn't need to. She just looked at the traps when I pulled them and made the small, flat palm motion, and I understood it had become something between us, a private acknowledgement. You were right. It's noted. We move on. One evening she wrote me a longer note than usual. She'd been inside while I finished a late set, and she'd had time with the board. And when I came in, she set it in front of me on the table with her hands in her lap and her face very still, the way it went when something mattered to her. She'd written about her father, not in the broad strokes she'd given me before. She'd written specifically. His name had been Thomas Marsh, and he'd been a meticulous man, she wrote, the kind who cataloged everything, believed in systems, and taught his students, most of whom could hear, a few of whom couldn't. That language was not the same thing as speech, and that one could exist without the other. He'd taught Della to read and write before she was 4. He taught her the sign system he'd been adapting and refining for 20 years, which was different from what they used at the schools back east, and which he said was more complete. He'd taken her into the field so she'd know the natural world the way he knew it, because, he said, it was a vocabulary of a different kind, and a person who could read sign and read land and read weather was not at a disadvantage. They were a different kind of fluent. She wrote at the end, I have been trying to find somewhere his vocabulary would be useful. I think I found it. I sat there looking at that sentence for a while. Then I turned the board over and wrote on the back, Your father sounds like he knew what he was about. She took it back and read it and wrote, He did. He also said I would outlast the people who underestimated me. He was right about that too. I looked at her when I handed the board back. She was serious. She'd gone somewhere inside herself when she was writing those words, back to the man she'd learned them from, and there was grief in her face, but also a kind of solidity, like she'd stood on something he'd built and the ground had held. I said he knew his daughter. She wrote he knew me. Not many people do. I said I'm learning. She looked at me for a moment. Then she wrote, I know, that's why I'm still here. I realized one morning, somewhere above 9,000 feet with the sky so blue it almost hurt and the wind cold and clean and no one for a day's ride in any direction, that I'd stopped thinking of her as someone who had arrived and would eventually leave. I'd stopped calculating the fact of her presence as temporary. She was just there, the way the ridge was there, the way the creek was there. A thing I'd come to account for, without meaning to, and that I'd noticed the subtraction of in a way that would probably take a while to recover from. I didn't say any of this. I was never a man who said those kinds of things. I'd made my peace with that, along with everything else, a long time ago. But she knew. I think she knew before I did. It was the end of April, a Tuesday I'm fairly certain, when the 2 men came up from the lower valley. I heard them before I saw them, horses on the rocky stretch below the cabin, 2 sets of hooves, not particularly trying to be quiet. I was working the pelt table out front when they came around the bend in the trail and stopped about 30 yards off. 2 men in trail clothes, both mounted, both with rifles in their scabbards. The one in front was heavy-set, red-faced from the climb, with a mustache that wanted to be more impressive than it was. The other was younger, thinner, watching my hands. Redface said, You Briggs, Callum Briggs. I said, depends on who's asking. He said his name was Marsh, Harold Marsh, and that he was looking for a woman, his wife's cousin, who'd gone off on her own from Cheyenne in the fall and hadn't been heard from since. He said the family was worried. He said it like he was reading from something he'd rehearsed. I said, haven't seen any women up here. He said, she can't speak, mute from birth. Somebody in town said a trapper up the fork had a woman staying with him and she didn't talk. I said, whoever told you that was mistaken. He looked at my face, the scar, specifically, and then away, and I watched something move in his expression that told me everything I needed to know about what kind of man he was. A man who uses what he finds. A man who looks at a disadvantage and tucks it away for later. He said, mind if we look around, won't take long. I said, I mind quite a bit. The younger one behind him shifted in his saddle, not reaching for anything, just repositioning. I said, you've come a long way. I appreciate the concern for your kin, but there's nobody here but me, and I'd appreciate you heading back the way you came before my afternoon's entirely wasted. Red Face looked at me for a long moment, a man trying to decide how much trouble he was willing to make. I'd been in that calculation before from both sides. I knew what it looked like. He said she took something from the house before she left. I said, then file a complaint with the sheriff. There's one in Laramie. He said, I'd rather handle this personal. I said, I noticed. He sat there another moment. The younger one had gone still. The horses moved their heads. Then Redface said, You're sure you haven't seen her? I said, I'm sure. He held my eyes one more second, and then he turned his horse, and the younger one turned with him, and they went back down the trail. I stood at the pelt table until the sound of the hooves was gone, and then a bit longer, until the silence had settled back fully. I went to the Dunmore cabin. She was inside, against the far wall, standing very still. She'd seen them through the crack in the repaired window board. She knew. I said, they're gone. She came away from the wall. She crossed the cabin floor and she did something she hadn't done before. She put both hands flat on my chest, not grabbing, just resting there, and looked up at me. Her face was completely steady, not frightened, but she was shaking just slightly in the hands. I covered her hands with both of mine. I held them still. I said, he won't come back. Men like that don't come back when they don't find what they're looking for. It costs them too much. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she pulled one hand free from mine and raised it and made the hand shape she'd shown me that first day in the door. The one she'd told me meant my name, Callum. She made the shape slowly and deliberately and kept it there and looked at me while she did it. Like she was saying, I know exactly who you are. I know exactly who I'm standing in front of. I don't have a good way to tell you what that did. I'm not a man who, I hadn't been named in a long time. Not like that. Not with intention. Most people, when they look at me, see the scar first and me second, or don't look long enough to see much of anything. She was looking right at me, her hand making my name in the air, and it was the most plainly I'd been seen by another person in more years than I could count. I said, you don't have to go anywhere. She lowered her hand. She looked at me steady. I said, I mean that. This can be your place as long as you want it to be. I'm not offering it to you, as I'm not going to make something complicated out of it. I just want you to know it's yours if you want it. She reached for the board and the burned stick on the cot beside her, and she wrote quick, without hesitation, I want it. Then she wrote, I want you. She held it up so I could read it, and then she set it down, and she looked at me exactly the same way she'd been looking at me, direct, unhurried, no performance to it. Just a woman who'd made up her mind and saw no reason not to say it plain. I stood there for a moment, being a man who didn't know quite what to do with being wanted. Then I said, all right. She almost smiled again, the same thing around the eyes. After the men left, I spent 3 days watching the lower trail. Not obsessively, I had work to do and I did it, but each morning I went out before light and listened for horses, and each evening I walked the trail down to where it bent around the rock outcrop and checked the ground for fresh prints. Nothing came up. Red Face had made his calculation and decided the cost wasn't worth it, same as I'd told her. But it took her a week to sleep without one ear open. I could tell because her eyes in the morning were slightly wrong, not exhausted exactly, just not rested. When it passed, maybe 10 days after the men had gone, there was a morning she came out of the Dunmore cabin with her hair still loose and her eyes clear, and she stood in the early sun and stretched both arms out and tilted her face up, and I was crossing the yard with a bucket and I stopped and watched her do it. No reason. I just stopped. She saw me watching and lowered her arms. She made a short sign. I knew it by then. She used it sometimes when she caught me looking at something I hadn't intended to stare at. It meant, "What?" I said, "Nothing." She did the sign again, slower. "What?" I said, "You look like a woman who slept." She considered that. Then she nodded once and went inside. There was no ceremony to it. We were not ceremony people, either of us. What there was instead was a gradual shifting of the geography, her things moving into my cabin by degrees, her skills and my skills braiding together over the spring and summer into something that worked better than either alone had. She knew plants I didn't know, could read weather signs I'd missed, had a patience for detailed work, the fine scraping and stretching that my hands, which had gone stiff in the cold winters, sometimes didn't manage as well as they used to. I knew the high country terrain and the waterways in which rock falls were new and which were old and stable, and I was still faster and stronger on the long days. What we made together was efficient, but that's too small a word for it. The summer was the driest I'd seen in 8 years, which meant the creek sections went low by July, and the beaver moved to deeper water, and I had to extend the line further north than I'd worked it before. Della kept pace with every adjustment. When the lower sets went quiet, she helped me relocate them without being asked, just tracked where I was going and showed up the next morning ready to work the new sections. She had a sense of the land that was different from mine, not better, not worse, just differently calibrated. Where I read the water patterns and the terrain features, she read smaller things, what the birds were doing in a particular section, the state of specific plants along the bank, the behavioral patterns of animals she'd been watching for weeks. Between us, we were missing very little. There were evenings in the high summer when the work was done, and it was still light until nearly 9, and we'd sit outside, her on the step, me on the old stump I used as a work seat, and she'd have her board or she wouldn't, depending on whether there was anything that needed saying, and sometimes there was, and sometimes there wasn't. I had never been comfortable with silence that contained another person. I'd always felt before like silence shared was a thing that needed to be filled or explained or apologized for. With her, it was just what it was, the aspens talking to themselves, the creek somewhere below, the sky going from blue to orange to the first thin purple of dusk. One evening in late July she wrote, "Do you ever want to go somewhere else?" I said, "Where would I go?" She wrote, "Anywhere. It doesn't have to be somewhere specific. Some people want to move, to see what's past the next ridge." I thought about it. I said, "When I was younger, maybe. Now I think this ridge is what I want to see." She looked at that. Then she wrote, "That is a very settled thing to say." I said, "Is that bad?" She thought about it, her head tilted slightly, and then she wrote, "No, it's rare. Most men I have known were always looking past where they were." I said, "Past the next ridge and the next after that. Yeah, I know those men." She wrote, "I don't miss them." I said, "Neither do I, and I barely know them." She almost smiled, held it there for a moment. Then she looked back out at the ridge, and we went back to being quiet, and it was fine. She learned to braid her skills and her presence into the days so naturally that I'd sometimes look up from work and find her at the table, or at the fire, or standing in the doorway looking out at the ridge, and there'd be this settling, a particular kind of quiet that I'd stopped knowing I was missing, a weight back in the air that had been absent for years. I was learning the signs, slowly, in the way an old dog learns something new, mostly by watching, occasionally making a fool of myself, frequently getting corrected with that almost smile. She'd built a vocabulary between us of maybe 40 or 50 signs by summer, enough for most of what we needed. When it wasn't enough, the board was there. When the board wasn't there, her face was. She was expressive in a way that people who'd never been around her would have missed entirely, looking for the wrong things. It wasn't in big gestures. It was in small ones, a tilt of the head, a shift in the set of her mouth, the way her eyes went when she was thinking versus when she'd made a decision versus when she found something genuinely funny. I'd been reading that language all summer without knowing I was doing it. One morning in August, early, the air still holding the cold of night though the sun was already full and bright on the ridge, I came out with 2 cups of coffee, and she was sitting on the step watching a hawk make long, slow loops over the creek flat. I sat down beside her and handed her a cup. She took it. She didn't look away from the hawk. We sat there for a long time without any kind of exchange. I watched the hawk. I drank my coffee. At some point her shoulder was against mine and I wasn't sure exactly when that had happened. She made one sign, simple, one I'd learned early. The flat palm, fingers together, a small movement outward. Thank you, or something in that family, something in that direction. I didn't ask what she was thanking me for. I understood that she wasn't thanking me for the coffee. I understood something larger was meant by it, and that she was trusting me to understand, and that the trusting was part of the thing itself. I said, "Don't thank me." She looked at me questioning. I said, "You found this place as much as I did. You fixed half of what was broken in it. I stopped for a moment and looked out at the ridge. I wasn't much before you got here. I thought I was fine. I was not fine." She watched me say all of that. Then she wrote on the back of her hand with a finger, the way she sometimes did when the board was inside, miming the letters out. 3 letters. I read them, nor. Neither was I. I looked at her hand. Then I looked at her face. The sun was on her and she was looking at me the same as she always looked at me, like I was a person, a specific person, worth looking at without flinching, and I put my arm around her and she leaned her head against my shoulder, and we stayed that way until the hawk was gone and the coffee was cold. The second winter settled in slower than the first. More warning, days of high gray cloud in October before the first hard freeze, the aspens dropping in a long gold cascade across the ridge, rather than going all at once the way they had the year before. I added a second lean-to off the north side of the cabin for the wood supply, and Della spent 2 weeks in early November rechinking the walls where the mud plaster had been working loose. She was methodical about it, working from the bottom up, packing and smoothing each course before moving to the next. By the time the first big snow came in December, the cabin held heat like a different building entirely. She'd started a garden in the corner of the yard that got afternoon sun. Nothing yet, the ground was frozen, but she'd cleared the sod and turned the soil and composted it all fall, marking the rows with small stones. Something to tend in the spring, something that said she was planning past the season she was in. I didn't say anything about the garden. I didn't need to. I just went around it with the woodpile work, and when the first snow fell on the turned soil and the small stones, I stood there for a moment looking at it before I went inside. There is a thing I know now that I didn't know at 43, which is that you don't come to matter to people by announcing yourself. You don't earn it by volume or by force or by being the most obvious thing in a room. You earn it the same way you earn anything out here. By showing up, by doing the work, by being useful and steady and honest when it would be easier not to be. I'd done those things all my life and I'd thought they were going unremarked. Maybe they were by most people, but she remarked them. She saw the trapline I'd built and the cabin I'd kept and the way I dealt with her honestly when I didn't have to, and the way I stood in front of 2 men who wanted to take her back to something she'd fled, and she put it all together into a picture of a man she apparently thought was worth knowing. I don't know what I looked like in that picture. I try not to think about it too hard. It does something to me that I don't have a clean word for. Not embarrassment, not exactly pride. Something between them. Something that requires a man to sit very still for a moment and look at a ridge or a fire or a hawk making long loops over a creek flat while he gets himself settled. We went to the trading post in September to sell the summer bales. It was a 2-day trip down out of the high country, and Della was quiet for most of it in the way she was when she was thinking about something she hadn't resolved yet. When I asked if she was all right, she made the tilted head gesture that meant she was considering something. She didn't elaborate and I didn't push. What I think she was considering was people. In the months since February, she'd been around very few of them. Me and the two men in April and no one else. Going to the trading post meant Mackinnon and whoever else was passing through. And that meant a room where she'd have to navigate looks and questions, and the particular kind of confusion or pity or bright, over-careful kindness that people offered a woman who didn't speak. Mackinnon, who'd been running the post for 20 years and had known me for most of them, looked at Della and then at me and didn't say a word except to ask after the catches. He shook her hand when I introduced her, said Miss Marsh, in a flat businesslike tone, and then proceeded to weigh the bales and calculate the price and conduct the whole transaction as if there was nothing unusual about anything, which was the right thing to do, and I was grateful for it. There was a moment, while Mackinnon was in the back getting the scale balanced, when a young couple came through the door, settlers by the look of them, heading further west. The woman saw Della and then saw me speak to Della and saw her not answer, and the woman's face went through a process I recognized. Confusion, then a kind of calculating sympathy, then a bright, determined smile that she aimed at Della like it was a gift. The settler woman said, very slowly and very clearly as if volume might help, "Good afternoon. Are you all right? Is this your—" She looked at me, then back at Della, clearly unsure of the arrangement. Della looked at the woman for a moment. Then she got her board from the coat pocket she kept it in and wrote, neat and quick, "Good afternoon. I am fine, thank you for asking." The settler woman read it and said, "Oh, how clever," which was not the right response but wasn't the worst one I'd heard, and Della just put the board back in her pocket and turned back to the counter, and that was that. On the way back up the fork, her beside me on the wagon seat with her coat pulled close, and the aspens turned gold and rattling in the September wind, I said, "You handled that well. The woman in the post." She shrugged one shoulder. Then she wrote on her board and held it up without looking at me. "I have been handling women like that my whole life. You learn to find it more funny than frustrating." I said, "That's generous of you." She wrote, "It is efficient of me." I said, "Mackinnon thought you were good for me." She looked at me, waiting. I said, "He's right." She put her hand over mine on the reins. She didn't sign anything. She didn't need to. The winter that followed was the hardest in 3 years, early snow in October, temperatures that didn't relent, the creek frozen solid for 6 consecutive weeks in January. The line got worked anyway. The wood got split and stacked anyway. The cabin stayed warm. There was a night in late January when the temperature outside was 30 below, and inside we had the fire and a lamp, and she was teaching me more of the signs, patient, going back over the ones I kept fumbling, not making me feel like an idiot about the fumbling. She'd lay my hand into the right shape sometimes, her fingers around mine, and hold it there until I had the feel of it. I had the names down, the ones I used most. Her name first. My own name, the shape of it, which I now understood not just as a motion but as a thing she had given me. She had taken my name and turned it into something that existed in her hands and could be made visible, and she'd chosen to do that, first day in the doorway, before she knew me, as a kind of greeting and a kind of promise both. She was teaching me the sign for home. I was getting it wrong, which surprised me, because it's not a complicated motion, one hand, a specific shape and position, a small movement. She corrected me for the 3rd time, guiding my hand into the right shape. I held it there, looking at it. I said, "What's the sign for?" I stopped. I wasn't sure how to ask what I wanted to ask. She looked at me, waiting. I said, "What's the sign for this, what we have?" She thought about that for a moment. Then she showed me 3 things in sequence, her name, my name, and then a 3rd sign, both hands brought together. I watched her do it. She did it again, slower. I tried it. Her name fumbled slightly, then my name better now than the 3rd sign, both hands coming together. She watched me do it and something opened in her face. Not the almost smile, something more than that. Something she'd been holding at a slight distance that she let fully forward. She did the sign for home again, and then she pointed to the floor, right here. This place. I said yes. She nodded. I said it again because it was worth saying twice. Yes. Outside, the wind was working at the boards and the temperature was 30 below, and the trapline was frozen solid, and none of that mattered at all. The fire was good. The lamp was low. She was across the table from me with both her hands still making the signs between us, her name and mine and the third one that meant what we had. And she was looking at me the way she'd looked at me since the beginning, like I was the specific thing she'd found, the specific person she'd decided on. And I sat there and let myself be seen, and it was all right. It was, in fact, better than all right. A man gets told enough times, one way or another, that he's not much worth looking at. That the damage he carries puts him outside the circle of things worth wanting. A man lives with that long enough. He stops pushing against it. He accepts the perimeter he's been assigned, and he works inside it, and he tells himself it's fine. It wasn't fine, I know that now. What she did, what she kept doing, every single day, looking at me like I was something, didn't erase the years of it. Doesn't work that way. But it put something down beside it. A counterweight. Evidence to the contrary, submitted by a woman who was not a fool and not given to easy choices, and who'd had every reason in the world to keep moving and keep her distance from men she didn't know. She stayed, she chose this, she chose me. The fire burned down some, and I got up and put more wood on it, and when I came back to the table she had the board out. She'd written one thing on it while I was up, and she turned it toward me when I sat back down. It said, "You're the only person I have ever signed my name to." I read it twice. Then I looked at her. She held my eyes, serious, wanting me to understand what she meant by it. That the sign, the shape she'd made that first day in Dunmore's doorway, was something she chose. That she'd learned signs for things and people over her whole life and hadn't given that one to strangers. That she'd given it to me before she knew me, because something in that cold doorway had told her I was worth it. I said, "I'll carry it right." She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she erased the board with her sleeve and set it down, and she leaned forward and put both her arms around me, her head against my chest, and I put my arms around her and held on. The wind hit the boards hard and the fire settled, and the lamp light moved, and outside it was 30 below, and the world was deep in the dark of winter. And in here she was warm against me and steady, and my name was something she carried in her hands. And I was, for the first time in a very long time, exactly where I was supposed to be.